Good morning. Bonjour tout le monde. Madame la secrétaire.
Merci. We'll start this morning with a presentation of Manitoba Coalition. Please introduce yourself and your colleagues, and you may begin.
Good morning, bon matin. My name is Katrine Dilly. I'm a lawyer with the Public Interest Law Centre in Winnipeg and legal counsel to the Manitoba Coalition. To my right is Mr. Benjamin Klaas, who is a consultant to the Manitoba Coalition, as well as a graduate student in his PhD at the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University. To my left is Gloria Dezorsi, the Executive Director of the Manitoba branch of the Consumers Association of Canada, and I'll refer to them as CAC Manitoba throughout our comments this morning. And to her left is Damon Johnston, President of the Aboriginal Council of Winnipeg. On behalf of CAC Manitoba, the Aboriginal Council of Winnipeg, and Winnipeg Harvest, we thank the Commission for the opportunity to provide our comments this morning. While Winnipeg Harvest, our other client organization, would have liked to be here in person today, they unfortunately were unable to attend. In terms of a brief roadmap for our presentation this morning, we'll begin by providing brief background information on this unique coalition of organizations that is before you today. Ms. Dezorsi and Mr. Johnston will then discuss the importance of this hearing to all Manitobans, and Mr. Klaas will then present findings of his and Dr. Winsek's expert evidence that was filed on the record of this proceeding. Ms. Dezorsi and Mr. Johnston will then present findings from the consumer engagement undertaken by the Manitoba Coalition, and I will then close our presentation by going through the recommendations of the Manitoba Coalition. Informed by the overarching role of the Commission to regulate and supervise in the public interest, the Manitoba Coalition has approached this hearing by asking itself whether an appropriate balance is being struck between the interests of the industry and consumers in the wireless marketplace. The evidence in this proceeding has demonstrated that balance is not being achieved. The wireless market does not work for all Canadians, especially for low-income Canadians and other vulnerable consumers. As a result, it is time for the Commission to act for three main reasons. First, because of the importance of wireless access for meaningful social and economic inclusion. Second, the industry has consistently failed to provide the services that are needed by Canadians and Manitobans at affordable prices. And third, the Commission's policy objectives and Section 7 of the Telecommunications Act, as well as government policy directives, emphasize affordable access for all Canadians. The Manitoba Coalition brings a unique consumer-focused perspective from the Manitoba-specific marketplace. CAC Manitoba is a volunteer, nonprofit, independent organization working to inform and empower consumers and to represent consumer interests in Manitoba. Winnipeg Harvest is a nonprofit, community-based organization which is committed to providing food to people who struggle to feed themselves and their families. And they also actively advocate for broader strategies to end poverty. The Aboriginal Council of Winnipeg is an Indigenous political organization representing First Nations, Inuit and Métis living in Winnipeg. Among other activities, it seeks to ensure that Indigenous voices are represented around the tables of decision makers, policymakers, as well as service providers. In terms of preparing the intervention of the Manitoba Coalition in this proceeding, the Manitoba Coalition worked with numerous other community groups, including groups who represent persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, and newcomers to Canada. The Manitoba Coalition conducted significant consumer engagement with over 1,000 consumers. That included a large-scale survey, which collected responses from over 1,000 Manitobans, a survey that was circulated amongst community groups that specifically work with consumers who may face specific challenges or barriers in the marketplace. And they also conducted more qualitative engagement sessions with newcomers to Canada, clients and or volunteers at Winnipeg Harvest, which is the largest food bank in Manitoba, students at the Niiganen Centre, an organization that promotes the social, educational, and entrepreneurial growth of the Indigenous community in Winnipeg, and finally a session with students, seniors, and rural consumers. And finally, in terms of its intervention, the Manitoba Coalition also retained the services of two independent, highly qualified expert witnesses, Mr. Benjamin Klaas and Dr. Dwayne Winsek. They were asked to independently assess the state of retail competition in Canada's mobile wireless markets, review Canada's mobile wireless markets in comparison to other countries, and finally comment on whether mandated wholesale access for mobile virtual network operators, or MVNOs, may be an outcome of this proceeding. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Johnston now.
Please open your mic. Yes. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you. So with more than 31 million subscribers, the retail mobile wireless service market is a critical means by which Canadians connect with each other and the broader world. Wireless services enable us to be socially included by connecting with friends, family, government services, community organizations, employment opportunities, and emergency lifelines. For consumers who do not live in urban centers, including Indigenous consumers living in rural and remote First Nations, wireless service can be the primary means of accessing many essential services, as well as connecting with family and close ones who do not live nearby.
The Manitoba Coalition is deeply concerned that the wireless market does not work for all Canadians, especially for low-income Canadians and other vulnerable consumers. While telecommunications companies boast about their speed and coverage across the country, high-quality wireless services are of little use if they are simply out of reach for too many Canadians due to a lack of affordability. Canadian consumers have been on a patient regulatory journey and have waited long enough. It is time for the Commission to act.
Thank you, Katrin.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Katrin, Gloria, and Damon. My name is Ben Klaas. I'm a PhD candidate at Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication and a senior researcher at the Canadian Media Concentration Research Project, which is directed by Dr. Dwayne Winsek. The Manitoba Coalition asked Dr. Winsek and I to assess the state of competition in Canada's mobile markets, including an international comparison of Canada's market performance, and to provide comment on the Commission's consideration of a potential mandate for MVNO access. In undertaking this work, we relied primarily on a broad range of publicly available data from authoritative sources such as the OECD, the US FCC, the European Commission, Statistics Canada, the CRTC, and others. Before going into the details, I'd like to note that as independent researchers, I see our first and most important duty as being to place reliable, credible evidence on the record to inform the Commission as it considers the matters before it. Our contract with the Manitoba Coalition reflects this independence. Our work has therefore focused on making assessments rather than recommendations. Our report covers two main areas: the performance of Canada's mobile market in relation to peer countries, and the role that MVNOs play in mobile markets. Using standard economic measures, our research finds that mobile markets around the world are highly concentrated, and that in this regard, Canada is not an outlier. While concentration levels on their own are not necessarily indicative of market power, anti-competitive behavior, or other undesirable market features, our examination of more detailed evidence supports the conclusion that current levels of market competition in Canada are failing to live up to expectations. First, there is some good news. Canadian mobile networks are generally fast and widely available. Canada's mobile networks perform consistently well in speed tests, and coverage of LTE, the most advanced technology available to date, is geographically broad, with existing gaps set to be addressed with help from the CRTC's Universal Broadband Fund. That being said, availability of service should not be confused with affordability or adoption. Near ubiquity of mobile signals provides cold comfort to those unable to afford service, or those who must restrict their usage due to high prices. On these measures, the evidence clearly shows that we are falling flat. Canada ranks consistently amongst the bottom of peer countries in terms of adoption of mobile broadband. As of June 2018, the most recent data available, we sat at 30th of 37 OECD countries in terms of smartphone penetration. Statistics Canada data showed that on a more fine-grained level, low-income households are drastically less likely to have mobile service than their higher-earning counterparts. As research conducted for the CRTC in 2016 explains, while lack of interest or low skill levels partially explain lower adoption and use among low-income individuals, cost remains a dominant motive for why low-income Canadians do not use the Internet. The data on price in Canada's mobile market supports this explanation. While no single price study or methodology is comprehensive or otherwise free from flaws, the preponderance of data from multiple sources point to one conclusion. Mobile prices in Canada tend to be amongst the highest and sometimes are the most expensive of peer countries. This is the case whether comparisons are made using service basket methods, regression analysis used by independent academic scholars or the US FCC, or whether prices are measured on a per gigabyte or RPU basis. In addition, according to the most recent WAL report conducted for Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, prices here tend to be falling more slowly than they have been elsewhere in G7 countries. While broad studies such as the ones canvassed in our report will always have exceptions and even flaws, the fact that so many different studies using so many different approaches all point to the same conclusion and that they have done so over an extended period of time is notable and concerning. Consumers in Canada are paying more and, as the data demonstrate, are using their services less than their peers in other countries as a result. Put simply, too many people are unable to realize the benefits of mobile service due to the high price. At the same time, the financial performance of the mobile industry in Canada has been robust. According to data from the CRTC and GSMA, average mobile EBITDA margins in Canada, a proxy for profitability, consistently exceed margins in other countries. At the same time, data from the European Commission show that Canadian mobile providers invest less of their revenue in capital than the average across EU countries for which data are available. If high prices were truly justified by higher capital requirements, as is often contended, capital intensity here would be closer to, if not higher than, the average in other countries, but that isn't the case. It has been suggested that mandating access for MVNOs may be required to address these problems. Our report canvasses the role of MVNOs in other countries, drawing on available market and academic research. Our research finds that MVNOs are a regular feature of mobile markets around the world, although their impact does vary in terms of number and market share. In some markets, their presence appears to be marginal, while in many of the countries studied, they appear to play a substantial and valuable role. In Canada, by contrast, MVNO presence is negligible due to the unwillingness amongst existing market players to voluntarily enter into agreements with such providers. The academic literature on the role of MVNOs in mobile wireless markets provides mixed lessons. Some authors point to the potential benefits of voluntary agreements between MVNOs and MNOs, while noting that it may be appropriate for regulators to consider mandatory access in cases where network operators are found to possess market power, as is the case in Canada. Other research suggests that mandated MVNO regulations may lead to decreases in network investment. Although these are qualified and it is observed that decreased investment may not necessarily lead to inefficient outcomes. Research also indicates that overall profitability, i.e. EBITDA margins, in mobile wireless markets can serve as a useful indicator for assessing the benefits of additional competition. In Canada, high profitability levels in the mobile market suggest that the market could sustain additional competition, and that this might help to make services more competitive and affordable. Further research shows that mandated access regulations enabling MVNO entries can be beneficial for consumers. Our report also examines a series of European mergers in which mandated MVNO access was implemented as a remedy to decreased competition. Although this approach was not always successful, a post-merger review conducted by BEREC found that MVNO remedies did have a positive effect on post-merger prices in at least some cases. Finally, our report notes that the CRTC's long-standing approach to wholesale access obligations in the Canadian wireline broadband market should be instructive when considering a similar approach in the wireless space. There are significant similarities between the wireline broadband market and the mobile wireless market in Canada. The Commission has consistently found that wholesale access obligations are a necessary and beneficial requirement for ensuring sustainable competition in retail markets for broadband internet access. The ongoing processes associated with wireline wholesale access regulations not only demonstrate the Commission's capacity to develop and manage these and similarly complex mechanisms, but they also indicate that there are firms already present in adjacent markets capable of leveraging their existing competence and market position to expand into mobile wireless markets should the opportunity arise. Based on our research and in specific consideration of the consistent shortcomings of Canada's mobile market, it is our view that the evidence, on balance, supports mandating wholesale MVNO access. I'd be happy to discuss the details further during questions. Thank you.
The findings from the Manitoba Coalition's direct engagement with consumers are consistent with our position taken previously. A number of problems persist in Canada's mobile wireless marketplace, resulting in a market that does not work for all Canadians. We have identified 5 main conclusions from the consumer engagement. First, cost and pricing are priorities for Manitoba consumers. For many Manitoba consumers, mobile wireless services are prohibitively expensive. Second, rates of adoption for wireless service remain lower for lower-income consumers. Third, rates of usage remain lower than consumers would prefer, which can be an indication that cost barriers persist for many market participants. Fourth, the range of available product offerings does not adequately meet consumers' demand for flexibility and choice and is not responsive to consumers' needs. And fifth, the majority of Manitoba consumers surveyed would choose a basic use wireless plan that includes talk, text, and data for $25 to $35 per month. I will start by discussing the first finding relating to cost and pricing in more detail, including referring to the Commission's public consultation report. Mr. Johnston will then discuss the other findings in more detail. The Manitoba Coalition's consumer engagement demonstrates that price is the most significant driver of consumer choice for mobile wireless services. Manitoba consumers have made clear that cost impacts their access to wireless services in a number of concrete ways. First, for respondents who did not have cell phones, cost was cited as a significant barrier preventing them from owning a cell phone. This finding is supported by the higher likelihood of phone ownership that was found among higher income respondents. Second, Manitoba consumers consistently said that price and cost are significant drivers of many facets of decision-making in the mobile wireless market. One indicator of this was the popularity of the basic use wireless plan, in which a majority of respondents were interested. Manitoba consumers also displayed a willingness to switch providers if comparable services were available through a different service provider for a lower cost. The Commission's public consultation reports similar findings regarding the importance of cost and pricing in consumer access to wireless services, satisfaction with the services, and consumers' decision-making process. In the Commission's online consultation report, almost half, or 45% of respondents, were at least somewhat dissatisfied with their current cell phone provider. And cost was the major reason for that dissatisfaction. Specifically, the cost of their cell phone service, 87%, the data, 86%, and overage charges, 53%, were the main reasons for dissatisfaction. The majority of respondents in the online consultation report said that the quality of service was good, but only 1 in 3 said they have a good selection of providers in their region, with 51% disagreeing that this is the case. Only 15% agreed that they get good value for money from their cell phone provider, and only 8% agreed that the cost of cell phone plans have decreased in the last 3 years. In fact, 74% of respondents disagreed that they get good value, and 83% disagreed that the cost of plans have decreased. An overwhelming majority, or 95% of respondents, think Canada's cell phone prices are worse than prices compared to other countries. In the representative telephone survey, 1 in 6 respondents were dissatisfied with their provider, with cost being the reason for dissatisfaction. In that survey, the majority of respondents thought that the quality of networks in Canada is high, but over half did not agree that they get good value for money from their cell phone provider, and 58% disagreed that the cost of cell phone plans has decreased in the last 3 years. 66% of respondents in the telephone survey thought that Canada's cell phone prices are worse than other countries. So both in Manitoba specifically and in Canada generally, it is clear that cost and pricing are key factors with respect to access to and satisfaction with wireless services.
Findings from the Manitoba Coalition's consumer engagement are consistent with concerns previously raised regarding lower adoption rates in Canada than in other countries, and specifically lower adoption rates amongst lower income consumers. Among some populations, cell phone adoption rates are high. For example, one survey indicated as high as 100% of respondents between 18 and 29 years of age were cell phone users. However, other populations, such as those over the age of 65 and lower income households, show lower adoption rates. To the Manitoba Coalition, this is an indication that cost remains a barrier to access, especially to those with particular needs or who face other barriers in the marketplace. It also demonstrates the market's failure to provide plans and service offerings that are responsive to the needs of some distinct consumer groups. Consumers have made clear to the Manitoba Coalition that they would increase their data usage if they could. For example, multiple consumers said that higher data made the proposed basic use plan more attractive. Many respondents used free Wi-Fi to supplement their data or displace their need for data altogether. The consumer engagement also showed that the range of product offerings and services in the wireless market do not meet the needs of Manitoba consumers. In the surveys, some respondents said that there's a product or service in which they are interested, but that is not currently offered by their provider. According to these respondents, the most highly sought service was more, and in some cases, rollover or unlimited data. The prospect of switching providers was particularly compelling for rural residents who expressed dissatisfaction with current rural network coverage and a willingness to switch providers for improved service. For many consumers, this has implications on safety as well as connectivity. The Manitoba Coalition also canvassed Manitoba consumers on the popularity of a proposed base use wireless plan. The proposed plan presented to respondents was described as costing $25 to $35 per month. The plan included a device as well as unlimited talk, text, and 1 gigabyte of data. Respondents were asked a series of questions about the price and contents of the plan with the intent of gauging their priorities. The findings demonstrate that price and the amount of data included in the plan are highly determinative of its popularity. While the majority of survey respondents said that they found this plan attractive at the initial proposed price and content, a larger proportion of respondents would find it attractive if it had 2 gigabytes of data or more. These findings suggest that the proposed price may be appropriate, but that 1 gigabyte of data may not be sufficient to meet consumer needs. This is also consistent with the Commission's Telecommunications Monitoring Report, which has found that the average monthly data usage is 2.5 gigabytes. Given the significant barriers existing in the marketplace, especially high prices, the need for a basic use wireless plan is pressing. There's a high potential for mobile wireless connectivity to positively impact the lives of Canadians who may face barriers in the marketplace. The Manitoba Coalition's consumer engagement has illustrated that demand for lower-cost network access is palpable and strongly suggests that a minimum of 2 gigabytes of data with talk, text, and a device included for up to $35 per month could meet the presently unmet needs of many.
And if it's acceptable to the Commission, I'll just spend a last 2 minutes on our recommendations of the Manitoba Coalition. Taken together, the lack of diverse and responsive product offerings, the low usage and adoption rates, and the high prices that Canadian consumers have to pay lead the Manitoba Coalition to a singular conclusion. Market problems plague mobile wireless services in Canada and must be addressed. The Coalition's consumer engagement has demonstrated that the negative impacts of these problems on consumers are not insignificant. In its role, the CRTC must strike a balance between the interests of the industry on the one side and consumers on the other side. and the evidence in this proceeding has demonstrated that there currently exists an imbalance in the wireless market in that it does not work for all Canadians, especially low-income Canadians and other vulnerable consumers. And so this leads the Manitoba Coalition to make two distinct but complementary recommendations to remedy this imbalance. First, the Manitoba Coalition recommends that the Commission mandate wholesale MVNO access subject to appropriate rates, terms, and conditions to be determined by the Commission, with rates based on capacity rather than per unit prices, as well as a periodic review of the effectiveness of this framework in achieving policy objectives. Second, the Manitoba Coalition recommends that a $25 to $35 basic use wireless plan, including voice, text, and data, be mandated as a condition of service that all wireless carriers must provide under Section 24 of the Telecommunications Act. The market is not working for all Canadians, and consumers have waited long enough and need the Commission to act. Just one final note regarding MVNO access. From the Manitoba Coalition's perspective, mandating MVNO access has the potential to enable diverse companies and entrepreneurs to enter the market, including businesses who may have a non-traditional business model. For example, the social enterprise model is a model that some Indigenous-led businesses have chosen, and these businesses may be enabled to enter the wireless marketplace as MVNOs if terms and conditions for wholesale support their entrance in this marketplace. Encouraging marketplaces that are more conducive to the formation and success of Indigenous-owned companies aligns with the objectives of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. In conclusion, the impacts of the mobile wireless market's failure to meet the needs of consumers perpetuates social exclusion and exacerbates economic marginalization. The Manitoba Coalition urges the Commission to exercise its authority to ensure that mobile wireless networks in Canada are set on a trajectory that will provide adequate, reliable, and affordable services in a manner that promotes economic opportunity and social inclusion for all Canadians. Subject to questions from the Commission, that's our presentation for this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Leisner.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your intervention and for the survey and engagement sessions that you conducted and the reports you filed. They made for very interesting reading. I'm going to start my questioning on the issue of the retail market power assessment. In the report you filed on May 15, 2019, you submitted that a comparison of Canada and international mobile wireless markets using various metrics shows that Canada is increasingly falling behind the rest of the world in terms of prices, penetration, and usage. As you've heard during this proceeding and read in the interventions, other parties, including the national mobile network operators, have questioned the relevance of international comparisons. They argue that most studies comparing Canada with other jurisdictions do not compare similar mobile wireless service plans. They don't take into account several socioeconomic factors and other factors such as our geography and our population density across the country. So I'd like to know how you respond to those criticisms.
Thanks. I'll start. So first of all, I think that there is going to be a problem in comparing Canada to other countries based on any methodology. None of them will be complete as a standalone look. So if one or two studies were to appear suggesting that the prices here are higher than others, I think it'd be reasonable to question them. But consistently since studying this market, my research interest in this area began roughly around 2010, 2011. Virtually every independent report that I've come across points to the same conclusion. And so when you see over time reports using different methodologies constantly pointing to the same thing, it I think lends credibility to those reports. One of the studies that we referred to in our report, I believe it is the Yun, Kim, and Kim study conducted in 2019, did use a regression method to assess the quality-adjusted price indices of mobile telecommunication services. So this particular method does control for a number of different factors. It was conducted independently of any particular interest in the industry and indicated that prices in Toronto for the service, controlling for other factors, were, I think, the highest amongst the dozen or so countries measured.
Did you file that?
Yes, it's
study?
figure 31.
Okay, great,
I mean,
thank
I filed some of the relevant findings of the study.
Would you be able to file the study for us?
Subject to any copyright concerns that might exist over the intellectual property, I can. I have access to these studies by virtue of my affiliation with the university, and so
I see.
Subject to clearing that, I would be happy to do so.
Thank you.
So that's one thing. The second I'd like to say is that we have a clear, I think clearly identified a problem in the market. The connection between price and adoption, I think, is fairly clear and supported by the research with which I'm familiar. But consistently, the one measure that I find the most troubling is the low adoption figure. So in previous years, prior to the emergence of the smartphone as a standard type of service, data and mobile voice, Canada's been right at the bottom of OECD countries for adoption. And this has been explained, I think, in part, or at least it's been justified in part by some parties that people in other countries might subscribe to more than one service on account of roaming regulations in Europe and the need to maintain different service plans. But I think that trend has increasingly disappeared in light of the smartphone service, the reliance on data as the primary means of communicating as opposed to voice, as well as efforts amongst European regulators to address the issue of expensive roaming between countries. And the Canadian standing in OECD metrics for adoption still remains very low. When we look specifically, and this is not a comparative figure, but when we look specifically at adoption levels in Canada, you see people earning over roughly 55 to 60K a year are more or less universally adopting services. They're north of 90%. Whereas below those figures in the bottom two quintiles, and this is Statistics Canada data I'm referring to that is submitted in the report, people earning lower incomes just aren't subscribing at the same levels. I believe it's in the area of 70% for the lowest income earning and families, and in roughly 85% for the next quintile. So I think that is a really clear problem in terms of the success or failure of Canada's communication policy. I think guaranteeing that access is there and within reach for people is, it's amongst the policy objectives of the communications legislation. The basic service policy that the CRTC established in 2016 includes access to mobile service, and it's clear to me that there is a portion of the population that just isn't able to avail themselves of that access here. So regardless of international comparisons on price, I think that this is a policy problem that really needs to be addressed.
And what are your views on Dr. Dippon's study? He appeared with TELUS. His conclusion that Canadian mobile wireless prices are below international benchmarks based on his study.
So I think you're referring to the accurate assessment of Canada's prices in comparison to other countries. This is the one that was in 2018 in response to the ISED
Dr.
study.
Dippon was an expert that appeared on behalf of TELUS, and in the assessment he did of plans in Canada, his view was that Canadian mobile wireless prices are below international prices.
So TELUS has recently undertaken a marketing initiative that is advertising their services as true north affordable, I think. And in response to this, I just casually investigated the price of service in the United States. They are currently running an ad campaign in the national newspapers suggesting that Canadians pay less than Americans for service. So I compared the TELUS family plans, which they've advertised under this marketing initiative, to similar plans available from an incumbent in the United States. And I found that factoring for exchange rates for 4 10-gigabyte plans, which is what TELUS offers for $60 a month for each line, it would be about $55 from AT&T in the U.S.
55 US or 55 Canadian with the exchange
55
rate?
Canadian, I'm sorry, yeah, I misspoke.
Okay.
About $55 Canadian, and I think that plan includes something like 50 gigabytes. So as I understand, and I'm not certain that I'm familiar with the particular details of the method used in that report, but doing just a simple comparison like that leads me to believe that the price for a service that provides quite a bit more in the U.S. Can be had for less money.
You've submitted in your May 15th intervention, I'm looking at paragraph 22, that the 3 national mobile network operators continue to occupy a dominant position in the marketplace, leading to high prices, low adoption rates, and low usage. And again, TELUS submitted in this proceeding that there is no economic or other evidence that establishes a correlation between mobile wireless penetration rates or data usage and the retail prices. We've seen in Quebec that the rates are lower than elsewhere in Canada, and yet the wireless adoption in Quebec is also lower than elsewhere. So is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about in support of your conclusion that the high prices are what result in the lower wireless penetration rates and usage? You've talked a little bit about this. I just want to ask if there's anything else.
My conclusions are primarily supported by a report that was commissioned for the CRTC by Drs. Rajabun, Ellis, and Middleton in 2016. There was a survey on the literature with respect to affordability of telecommunication services. And I think that the conclusions of that study drew a strong connection between the price of service and people's adoption and use of those services. I think it goes to sort of fairly foundational economic principles that higher prices will depress service and usage. And so in the report that we've made, I think all the boxes are checked in respect to that connection. In terms of causation, I can't sit here and say that I've conducted a study that removes all doubt that for all customers, price is the determinative factor. But I think it is amongst the strongest. There are other factors involved, and I'm familiar with research that suggests people thinking that it's not something that they find useful, not knowing how to use the service, are also factors that explain that. But in my opinion, and on the face of the evidence, price is the strongest factor explaining the difference in adoption.
Thank you. Now, since that study, we've seen the introduction of unlimited plans by the national MNOs around June of 2019. And do you think that those represent a significant development in terms of competition in the mobile wireless retail market? Do you think they're meeting consumer expectations?
I think that the introduction of unlimited plans is undoubtedly a positive development. It's come significantly later in Canada than it has in other countries. And there are also concerns that I have with the way in which it's being introduced. So I'll start with a discussion of the unlimited plans that are branded as Infinite or Peace of Mind.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you just said.
There are essentially 2 tiers of these plans that have been introduced. One group being through the main or flagship brands, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, and then another type of unlimited plan that's been introduced through the very discount brands, Lucky and Chatter. In terms of the first plan, I think that on a per gigabyte basis, it represents a significant reduction in price. So you see that for a similar price level, the people who access these services are getting access to more data. that's undoubtedly positive. As I said, these have come later than they have in other countries. So for instance, I know numerous people, and this is anecdotal, but who rely on mobile wireless service as their primary means of internet connectivity. For instance, I have a friend who travels to work on pipelines in the US who only relies on his mobile service. The allowances there for the price are much more generous, and I think the level of usage that's made available before the service is throttled here is quite a bit lower in comparison to the prices, for instance, available in the States on an unlimited basis. According to Rewheel's research, the prevalence of truly unlimited plans with caps that are so large that a user couldn't realistically hit it, have been increasing, and we haven't yet seen those here. So while it is positive, I think in comparison to developments in other countries, there's still a lot of room for improvement there. In addition, these plans have been, I'm sorry, did you have a?
No, go ahead.
In addition, these plans have come also at a time when the device has been separated into a sort of separate item, right? So the financing of devices, whereas previously the plans that were offered by the flagship brands would include, I think, part of the price of the device within that service plan. So you'd get the phone for that top line price with, you know, potentially some upfront payment. So I think some analysis would need to be undertaken to do a comparison of the actual price customers are paying now for the total cost of service, including the phone, versus the bundled price, to see how these new price plans actually compare. So looking at the per gigabyte price only tells you part of the story. That being said, the $75 or $65 in Quebec price plan is the floor, and that's quite high, I think. So there's another type of plan that's been made available without the overage fees by Lucky and Chatter. And I think that that is undoubtedly positive because, as we discussed in the report, the most acute and, well, it's acute and chronic, but problem is in the lower end of the market. So removing overage fees from lower priced plans is something I think that for price sensitive customers is very helpful. However, there are a number of ways in which these plans are have the quality reduced that I think is discriminatory and merits some investigation, particularly in terms of the way they're advertised. So both Chatter and Lucky advertise their lower priced, no overage plans as 3G to customers, which I think up until, you know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago was more or less the standard. The 3G or HSPA standard for mobile connectivity affords speeds up to 42 megabits per second, in my understanding. But in fact, what these 3G plans are LTE plans that have the speed throttled to 3 megabits per second. So in my mind, as a person who's reasonably informed about this, when I see 3G, I'm thinking up to 20 megabits per second, when in fact they're throttled to something much less. So there's a transparency problem with respect to that, as well as something that I think is hard to justify, and that's for these lower price plans. Once you hit the limit for the month, your speed is throttled to much slower speeds than it would be for those higher level plans. So they tell you for a Bell unlimited plan, you hit the limit and you are throttled to 512 kilobits per second, which is a reasonably, it's, I think, an old definition of broadband might include that speed, but you can still stream low definition video. You can still use your device more or less as normal. Chatter, on the other hand, will throttle to 64 kilobits per second once its users reach that limit. And that's dial-up speed, basically. So your ability to continue using that lower priced service afterwards is significantly reduced. And I think that the Commission has rules about internet traffic management practices that look with a skeptical eye towards that type of discrimination. And so for me, I see these lower price plans that differentiate themselves on the basis of speed as a positive improvement, with the caveat that some of the terms that are connected to them are discriminatory and wind up punishing the people who can only afford that service.
And do you think that that it's fair to say that consumers looking at these plans don't find them interesting because of some of those factors you've just mentioned about the throttling after a certain point, making the speeds a lot lower?
I think that it's hard to say ahead of time what the experience might be. The experience on mobile networks is going to be variable from time to time and depending on where you are in load on the network. But I think it'd be reasonable to say that someone experiencing a drop from 3 megabits per second to 64 kilobits per second might be frustrated.
You mentioned the price of handsets, and we've heard about a significant increase in recent years in the price of handsets, particularly with the introduction of smartphones. I believe Shaw, when they were before us, mentioned that the price of a smartphone had gone up from $1,000 to $2,000 in 1 year. Although there are many options in terms of handsets, and they are on a price scale that can range from a few hundred to $1,000. There's a second-hand handset market as well, we've seen. What I'd like to know is, to what extent do you think that the persons that you spoke with in your survey and in the engagement sessions who expressed concerns about high prices, were those concerns related to high prices for the service or the price of the handsets?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Leisner. Maybe before going into answering your question, which of course we will do, I just have a couple comments, if I may, on some of the previous questions you asked.
Oh, absolutely.
So just to add to Mr. Klaas's expertise on the international comparison, I think some of the findings from the CRTC's public consultation, of course not expert evidence, but some of the questions about international pricing were also instructive. Of course, we know a lot of Canadians have family abroad or have lived abroad, and so the overwhelming majority of those surveyed indicated that Canada's prices seem to be higher than other countries. More directly related to your question, in the surveys and the engagement sessions we conducted, or our clients conducted, cost and pricing were really top of mind when it came to decision making. And of course, that would be related to both service as well as handset device purchases. I think maybe I'll just turn it to Ms. DeZorcy if she has any comments at this point.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I agree that cost and pricing were really important. It was both the cost of service and the handset as well. And what I was just looking back to see was, it was also how one pays for the handset, and whether or not, particularly in the engagement sessions, there was a lot of discussion about, the trade-offs between having to pay interest essentially on a product when you buy it over a long period, trade it off with the value of not having to put out the large amount of money up front. So yeah, there is a lot of discussion, and cost is right at the forefront of it.
And I recall reading with interest that you received a number of comments that the persons you surveyed were not interested in having longer term contracts to amortize the cost of a phone over a longer period.
Yeah, the majority were looking for 2-year contracts or possibly 1. Some people said that they might like that option to have a lower, particularly not so much in the survey, but in the consumer engagement, they might like that option to have a lower price over time. But others were concerned about being locked into a specific company for a longer period of time, ending up after 3 years with a phone that is now somewhat outdated, those kinds of concerns. So there was a variety of response there.
And do you think it's fair to expect that given the increasing usage of data for a variety of functions that people use, whether it's streaming videos or texting or doing your banking online, that it's fair to say that that prices will go up given that increased data usage?
Not necessarily, especially given what Mr. Klaas indicated in terms of the per gigabyte price actually going down as some of those data buckets increase, and I'll let him speak more eloquently to that. I think what one of the main concerns of the of the Manitoba Coalition is that while we're seeing perhaps some of those larger data bucket plans, we're seeing some prices shift there, that's not necessarily responding to the needs of consumers who can't afford those plans. And so some consumers are looking for lower cost, lower capacity use, but they still want the capacity, or they still need the capacity to be able to function in today's society. And so it's really that sort of gap in the marketplace that we're seeing. So it's not occasional or emergency use that those consumers are looking for. They're looking for something meaningful that will enable them to participate in society without having to pay the prices that are prohibitive for some of those consumers at the upper data bucket numbers. And I'm not sure if Mr. Klaas would have anything to add on that.
So just to be clear, the question is, should we expect the unit price of data to increase in the future due to increasing demand?
The evolution in data allowances in recent years has meant that people are using more data. And do you think that as a result, it's only natural that these prices will go up?
So I think that the primary innovations in this space have been in the utilization of spectrum efficiently, first through 3G and then 4G, and the various sort of sub improvements that have taken place that essentially make the unit cost approach zero. I think that price, and there's, I think, a terrific study conducted in 1995 into problems of treating information as a commodity. You know, the decreasing marginal cost of what is the marginal cost of a bit. I know that the CRTC's process makes estimates using the phase 2 method as to what a megabyte costs, but I think really the cost is associated with building the tower, and then afterwards the primary driver is revenue requirements of the company. I think that, for instance, the rates that the CRTC has determined using phase 2 for mobile service, the roaming tariff, are per megabyte, but approximate out to about between $13 and $14 per gigabyte. This is supposed to be a cost-based rate, yet their average revenue for a gigabyte of data, according to the CRTC's most recent monitoring report, is $12 and change. So I think there's always going to be problems when you're trying to assign a cost to a unit in a decreasing marginal cost industry. The fact that the companies even charge per megabyte, I think, is much more closely related to their desire for the lucrative overage fees, which I believe at last report generated in the area of $1 billion a year. B, the ability to segment the market so that customers who make that usage will contribute more revenue. And C, the diagonal integration that each of the mobile operators is characterized by, and by that I mean the fact that they operate in adjacent related markets. A company that sells you mobile wireless service and home internet doesn't want you to be able to take the mobile service and ditch the home internet. So you see, I believe Rewheel conducted a study making comparisons of independent mobile operators versus diagonally integrated mobile operators some years ago. that found the independents are much more likely to offer generous data buckets. And I don't think that has anything to do with the cost structure of the market. It has everything to do with the business interests of a company that sells both of these services. And so in Canada, all of our mobile providers are now connected into these types of companies. And I think that that is something that at least needs to be considered when looking at the types of limits that are associated with these plans.
Thank you. You mentioned that part of the good news is that network quality is very good in Canada. And we've heard from Bell, for example, and the other MNOs that they need to continue making investments in networks, investing particularly in 5G, and that in order to deploy new technologies, these require high levels of investment. We've also heard that consumers have positive things to say about the network quality, and that they actually expect good network quality. So how do we reconcile the desire for lower prices with the financial needs of the carriers to continue investing in their networks to meet Canadians' expectations and also to ensure that we don't lag behind as a country in terms of our development of our network to the 5G level?
I was quite surprised by what I would quite frankly characterize as histrionics listening last week to the hearing. Surprised to the extent to which carriers have reacted to this, and also surprised that this is an argument we keep hearing over and over again. The data on capital investment in both the wireline and wireless sectors of the market indicate that capital investment has continued to rise. This is in spite of warnings, repeated warnings from the companies that any decision contrary to their interests by the CRTC would result in a capital flight. Since 2010 with speed matching in the wireline space, with the extension of the wireline wholesale obligations into fiber, and with the set-asides during auctions, as well as the Commission's decision to implement roaming regulations, each time a decision that runs contrary to management opinion about the best direction for the industry is undertaken by the CRTC or even considered, we hear the same argument. And it hasn't happened, so I think that has to be taken with a grain of salt. That being said, I'm not simply dismissing these types of arguments as histrionics. It is obviously important to continue to ensure that Canada has networks that meet the needs of individuals and of the business community. Increasingly, mobile service is relied upon by business in order to provide better services to customers. So I'm not simply saying that we should ignore what the carriers are saying, but I think that their response needs to be tempered. Research submitted or canvassed in our survey of the academic literature suggests that EBITDA margins can serve as a useful indicator when determining if an increase in competition can be sustained by the industry in terms of investment levels. It's in my report somewhere. I'm sorry, I forget the particular figure, but the report established essentially a range of EBITDA levels when that an authority ought to consider when making decisions such as the one before us. Found that in the 42 and above range, I believe, it's clear that the market can sustain increased competition without negative effect to investment.
And I gather your response would be the same if I talked to you about the carriers' needs to recoup the costs of their investment in spectrum, given the high prices of spectrum in Canada.
Yeah, so the ITA levels is something that I haven't investigated specifically. I'm aware of the discussion of high spectrum costs in Canada, and to the extent that that's a problem, I think it's something that ISED should certainly take up. May I add just one more thing on the investment question?
Absolutely.
I think that reduced investment, it's easy to use that as a threat. But when announcing network sharing agreements, carriers are quite glad to tout the reduction of investment as a cost-saving measure. So I think that if we simply look at investment big equals good, investment small equals bad is not the right way to look at these things. I think we need to look at the most efficient possible use of scarce resources such as capital, and to the extent that network sharing can contribute to that objective, that money could be better spent elsewhere. And in addition, one last thing is I think that there is the singular focus on price may be misguided. I think there are numerous different ways that you can measure price, and so simply saying we're going to bring the price down and everyone's going to have a plan for $5, and the company can't sustain those types of prices is not the best way to look at these things. I think there are ways that companies other than the ones in the market currently operating might think is an interesting way to offer service that makes the price a customer pays for it less without actually reducing the revenue. And so, for instance, during the CRTC's investigation into lower cost data plans, in 2018, I think, I had proposed a flexible plan that customer would pay, I think, $5 as a baseline, and then depending on usage, it would increase up to a level of, I think, $30 or $40. And I costed that out according to the tariff rate for mobile roaming, which in the Commission's decision, it equates the retail rates. And in designing that plan, I had made sure that the cost was above what the carriers were offering. So these are plans that are sort of available in the market to a limited extent, but the price jumps very quickly up to $40 if you use more than a marginal amount of data. So the carriers have decided not to offer that, even though it would be above the cost of above their costs, and frankly, very similar to plans that were already in the market, but just offering a bit of flexibility. So in terms of allowing MVNOs to come in, they might package the service in a different way that doesn't necessarily reduce the price, but makes the option nevertheless more affordable for customers.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe if I can just add here, Commissioner Leisner, from the consumer perspective, the Manitoba Coalition definitely recognizes that continued investments are important. And we've said that in our intervention, especially when it comes to rural and remote consumers, investments and continued investments are even more important. However, consumers currently are being left behind in the marketplace. And Mr. Klaas and Dr. Winsek's evidence shows that that is disproportionately lower income consumers. And so that's, from our perspective, there is an imbalance that exists. And so the priority cannot be given to continued unlimited investments. There's an imbalance that needs to be addressed currently. And so from our perspective, speculative concerns about the future of network investments can't be the only thing that are driving the decision-making process, especially given historical examples that Mr. Klaas, for example, referred to in the wireline industry. I think this was from the Competition Bureau that they indicated that lower investments may not mean underinvestments. And that also speaks to Mr. Klaas's point about efficient investing. And then I guess the final point, price is important. And that's one way that consumers can access the marketplace if prices are affordable. However, there are different business models that may also meet the needs of certain consumers in niche marketplace. So for example, social enterprises who may be geared towards better meeting the needs of certain communities, whether that be through on-the-ground service that is being provided in a remote First Nation, for example, or a salesperson going to speak to the people in a community to see what are their needs and why are they not able to afford the service. Price is important, but there are other ways that service and needs can be met for consumers.
Thank you. In Manitoba, we've seen the acquisition of MTS by Bell and XploreNet Communications has recently launched a mobile wireless service offering. Do you consider that competition in the province of Manitoba for mobile wireless services is better, worse, or about the same as it was before these developments?
Thank you. I'm just going to turn to, we had one of our survey questions, both in the quantitative survey of 1,000 Manitobans, as well as the open link, which was the same survey but distributed to community groups, asked a question about consumers' awareness of Explore Mobile in the marketplace. Unfortunately, the awareness of that company was not very high in our surveys. It was about a quarter of Manitobans who were surveyed who were even aware that the company was providing, awareness of XploreNet as the internet provider and Explore Mobile as the wireless provider was about the same, around 1/4 awareness. So to us, that was not great in terms of consumers' awareness of this now this fourth carrier in the province of Manitoba. Prices in Manitoba, of course, we have to look at it over time. One big development that we saw after the Bell MTS merger was that the removal of the unlimited data product offering that was offered by MTS prior to that. That was something based on our review and our participation in these hearings that was sort of unique to Manitoba. And of course, Manitoba prices on average were lower than the average across the country. So that product offering was removed off the market after the merger. I believe it's now back, as we just discussed a few minutes ago. So overall, I think based on our understanding of the marketplace, we would say that it's not very positive since the merger. And maybe I'll let Mr. Klaas add anything he might have.
Yeah, thanks, Katrin. I think that at present, Gloria and I are working on a 2-year pricing study comparing the price of mobile, home internet, and television service, thanks to funding from the Office of Consumer Affairs. Sorry. So we'll be able to come back with a definitive answer, I think, about the price movements in Manitoba. Up to that time, we haven't conducted the analysis. We're in data collection mode at the moment, so I think it's hard to say for certain. However, we've heard a lot, I think, already about the decline in prices, and it's something that you've observed in the Ontario, Alberta, and BC market in particular through the use of the flanker brands. I think just from a review of the websites, you can see that the prices have come down, particularly in the mid-range flanker brands. However, the prices for Manitoba and Saskatchewan for those same flanker brands have come up. So it's been a convergence of prices. And so, from the perspective of Ontario, BC or Alberta, I think there have been improvements in price, but in the context of BC MTS, I think it's resulted in at least on its face, and from my preliminary look at the data, has resulted in a price increase. So for instance, and I have pricing literature dating back to 2013 to show that prior to Bell's having taken over MTS, bring your own device plan for $48 would give a customer 5 gigabytes of data. The same flanker brands are currently charging $55 for 4 gigabytes of service. So while the unlimited plan disappeared for some period of time and has now come back in a different form, these other plans, and specifically the ones that were targeted towards mid users or lower end users, on initial look at the prices have actually come up in the wake of the merger.
Yes, and if we look at the Exhibits 1A and 1B that were filed at the beginning of this hearing with respect to the CRTC survey, I note that those 2 gigabyte plans that you propose be offered in Manitoba for up to $35 are widely available in Quebec, but not in Manitoba.
Yes, thank you. We noted that as well in terms of being available at the 2 gigabyte point in Quebec, but not elsewhere across the country. And so, thank you for noting that.
So do you think that, given the plans that ExploreNet talked about at the hearing here and the recent introduction of their service, do you expect that as they evolve, the level of competition in the Manitoba market will evolve and that you'll see some price reductions? Do you have any expectations in that regard?
So I think from our perspective, consumers have waited for a long time. So we were not involved with this coalition in the 2015 wireless review, but we read with interest the part of the record of that hearing as well as the decision, where a lot of the same problems that we're talking about today with respect to the marketplace were noted, and the Commission didn't go so far as to mandate MVNO access so as not to disincentivize investments. And so our concern is that consumers are currently being priced out, being left behind, with significant impacts on their lives, their families' lives, and their ability to afford to be able to meaningfully participate in society. And so certainly our concern is that waiting to see if competition will develop, as the companies say that it will, has not been working, and so that there needs to be additional steps taken. And so that's where our two recommendations are attempting to be complementary, in the sense that the mandated MVNO access we recognize will take time first to implement, and then will take time to have an impact on price, on diversity of product offerings, and other impacts on the marketplace. Competition will take time to develop. So the mandated basic use wireless plan that we're talking about would be sort of an immediate response to the needs of consumers who have been waiting for a long time to see products that are at an affordable price point for them and that meet their needs.
And I understand that your proposal on the question of mandating a lower cost plan is that it can be accomplished under Section 24 of the Telecommunications Act as a condition of service. But what's your view on whether or not the Commission should be deforbearing from Section 27(1) and or Section 25 on this basis, insofar as it's necessary to mandate that kind of a service for a specific segment of the population?
Thank you. At this point in time, and we've responded to this in requests for information, so I won't go into it in detail, but essentially we see that this could be a condition of service that be mandated, and that through a price ceiling and a capacity floor, that it would not amount to rate regulation that would require the Commission to deforbear in this area. However, we have also presented an alternative response in one of our requests for information that goes through the deforbearance analysis, if that is the route that the Commission chooses to go in for lower cost plans. But we do certainly believe that under Section 24, given the case law, the implementation of the wireless code, and the various components of the wireless code, that there is room under Section 24 to mandate this basic use wireless plan as a condition of service.
And we've had a number of different proposals for low-cost plans, including the one that you submitted. If we were to mandate a low-cost plan, how would the Commission assess the needs of consumers and decide on the characteristics of the mandated plan?
So I think that's a multi-part answer. So maybe I'll start, and I'll let my clients, Mr. Johnson or Ms. DeZorcy, answer as needed. So really the purpose of the basic use wireless plan, as we've started to call it, is to ensure that there's consistently plans in existence in the market that meet the needs of all consumers. Based on our review of the marketplace, the upper end of the market in terms of cost and capacity is currently being met, but the evidence that we've seen from our independent experts, as well as consumer engagement, shows that it's more the lower cost end of the market that still provides sufficient capacity for meaningful participation in society that is lacking. So we've undertaken some preliminary consumer engagement that you've seen in our surveys and engagement sessions. And we were trying to gauge what are the priorities of Manitobans to see what should be offered in a basic use plan. And so we started with a plan that was $25 to $35, including unlimited talk and text, and 1 gigabyte of data. And the interest was there. I believe it was close to half of consumers who were interested in that plan. When price increased over $35, interest dwindled considerably. And so we're seeing that after the $35, there are some issues there in terms of affordability. But when we increased the data to 2 gigabytes or more, interest went up a lot. And so our analysis of that is that 1 gigabyte is likely not enough to meet the needs of consumers in order to participate in society effectively, and that 2 gigabytes is likely closer to that. And based on our review of the CRTC's recent monitoring report, that's pretty close to the average use of data of Canadians, which is in the recent report 2.5 gigabytes. And so our proposed plan is a little bit lower than the average use of Canadians of data. We recognize that average use may be driven up by consumers who have unlimited data or very large data buckets. And so putting it at the 2 gigabyte mark, we think is close enough to the average use and still represents, there was still interest from consumers in that plan. One thing we think is very important is that this plan not be means tested. And so there are, based on our clients' participation in various proceedings and policy processes, means testing can be problematic in some instances, especially where there is sort of a hard cutoff. Someone who makes $1 more than the cutoff presumably would not qualify for these plans, but they may be dealing with very similar challenges to participation in the marketplace as the lower income consumers who would qualify for the plan. Ms. DeZorcy can likely speak more eloquently to this, but that would be something our clients think is very important. While we've done preliminary consumer engagement, we think that there could be further consumer engagement also done with Canadians about what do they need to see in a basic use wireless plan. This is meant to meet the basic needs of Canadians in order to participate in society. So we're not talking about the occasional use or emergency use, but we're also not talking about unlimited plans where you can maybe supplement or replace the need for home internet. We're talking about basic use. And maybe I'll let Ms. DeZorcy speak a little bit more to that, if that would be acceptable.
Yes, but just let me ask one question on that first. Your low-cost plan included unlimited voice calls. Did you mean Canada-wide voice calls within the province, or just unlimited voice calls?
I believe it would be Canada-wide.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah, certainly with regards to the means testing, I would reiterate that how difficult that makes a choice sometimes for consumers. How difficult it can be to decide, am I going to give up my tax return, my personal information to get into this program? You know, how far do I want to go in divulging my personal situation in order to get my cell phone? And so that's one side of it. The other side of it,
if I can just stop you there, one of the concerns about that means testing is that, you know, as consumers go and negotiate a plan or take up a plan, there's the whole issue of their credit, right? So would you suggest that to address that issue that the basic plan would be prepaid or still postpaid?
I would suggest that the basic plan be postpaid and without a credit check.
Without a credit check.
right? And I know that's going to seem different than what you might hear from others, but we feel strongly that if communication is a necessity, like electricity is a necessity, like other things that we get are necessities, because we don't have a credit history, perhaps we're new to the country, perhaps we have a credit history with some issues in it, should not be a reason for us not to be able to access those necessary services. So yeah, that's what we would say. And to go to the second point that you were discussing, and I'm sorry, I've just forgotten what was the thing that you spoke about afterwards? Yeah, I think I've already talked about the meantime. Sorry, there was something else that I was.
I'm sorry, it was me.
No, that's totally fine. I'm just trying to remember what your original question was. I'm sure I got onto.
Well, we were talking about what the characteristics of the plan would be.
And what I wanted to add was, to what Ms. DeLay was saying, I wanted to add that consumer engagement is really important to do on something like this, which is you're trying to tailor to the needs of certain groups of consumers more than once, right? You know, we've taken a Manitoba shot at it, but, you know, you would likely want to take a nationwide shot at it before you set up a plan, and then maybe run the plan past people a second time and see if you've got the right plan, if you've heard the right message. And then when it starts, you would want to be monitoring it. That would be the ideal way to, in my mind, to engage consumers on the topic of what works for them as a basic use plan. So we don't see it as kind of a one shot and done. You know, it may be that this is something that needs to be proposed, needs to start, and then needs to be monitored going forward.
In terms of monitoring, do you mean reviews at set time periods, or what were you thinking of in terms of suggested monitoring?
Evaluation from people who are using the plan, and also beyond that, evaluation from people who've chosen not to use the plan, but perhaps fit the demographic and why. They are, you know, we found, for example, we for the first time included in surveys and face-to-face engagement, this time consumers who did not have cell phones when we were talking about wireless. And it was illuminating to hear why they did not have cell phones, and to hear from those consumers on what that means for them in their lives, and what you know, they feel that they would be able to benefit if they could have that access to that. And so sometimes it's important not just to ask people who are using it, but people who are also not using it. And I don't know, Mr. Johnson, if you have, yeah, I think he would like to add something as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so can't really do justice to answering your question in the allotted time frame, but maybe we'll have some future opportunity. Indigenous perspective on some of these issues. Basically, so some of the question we're answering is how does Canada become a more inclusive society? How do we address issues like poverty in a better way? You know, I know as one Indigenous leader that we have the highest per capita rates of poverty in this country, and we know why that is, the history of all that. But we will speak to that at another occasion too. But here, having a phone, so this is my phone right now, but I guess theoretically, this phone could be an iPad. And we know that in addressing the digital divide, access to this kind of technology, as it continuously improves, is of huge importance to groups who are marginalized by society, who don't have the same access because of poverty and other issues. And then when you dig deeper into this, so Indigenous Canadians, we're 5% of the entire Canadian population. So if companies are going to argue that the cost of making a basic plan available to Canadians is prohibitive, then I would want to see, you know, real evidence of that. Because even though we're 5%, what percentage of that would need a basic plan? Because we have a growing middle class as well. I'm one of those people. So, you know, there's work to be done going forward to, if we're going to, create more opportunity for Canadians generally, and I'm saying it should be, not just Indigenous, but there's other Canadians who live in poverty as well, that these things are important decisions, and they speak more to creating, rather than just looking at a return on investment, we're looking at a social return on investment. And so as one practitioner of social enterprises, co-ops, credit unions, et cetera, Indigenous peoples, as we move forward on our self-determination, self-government, what that means to us is that we will, through Indigenous innovation, maybe address some things in a much better way going forward. And thinking outside the box. I think the private sector in Canada right now, must see to some degree. So today we see in the news that the Ontario Provincial Police have moved in to break up the blockade of the rail line here in Eastern Ontario. To some degree, that outcome, having to do that, is a direct result of our marginalization, of a failure to create opportunities, real opportunities for Indigenous peoples in this country, to create equality, equity. And as you know, those two things are different. So, but there's also on the good side of the equation, newer partnerships between the private sector and Indigenous Canadians that are showing real signs of progress. And so I think as we begin to engage more with the private sector, in this case with telcos, telecom companies, we can work with them to do these things in a better way. And to, as I say, close that gap, that huge gap in many cases between the social determinants of health outcomes of Canadians, of Indigenous Canadians and other Canadians. And that's one of our primary goals. We want to achieve equity with other Canadians. So I think, the CRTC is a creation of government, an institution of government, and that, you have to be, I think, committed to truth and reconciliation. And I think you have to be open to some of the offerings that we are going to make, that I'm making now as one Indigenous leader. And the last thing I'll say is that, there are some unique differences between First Nations persons, between Métis persons, and between Inuit persons, and what I represent, urban Indigenous community. But I'm also a First Nations person, but I never lived on my reserve. So, there's many differences within the Indigenous population itself, and some of our, business propositions are taking, an entrepreneurial form or a capitalist form, however you want to phrase it. But others of us are using social enterprise, newer forms of business structure, because we have different values. We have more of our traditional values, and we want to be able to share any, we call it excess revenue, that we generate in that kind of a structure. It's not profit. We want to be able to share that in a better way with our employees, with our community generally. And so, when we have concrete example of how that works. So I'll just stop there and thank you very much.
Well, thank you for those most thoughtful comments. I recall reading when I was looking at the materials that you submitted about comments made by individuals who said, for example, that they had no reception within their home. They had to go down the road to get reception to make a call out, but they couldn't get a call in. So certainly there are definite challenges there. And your comments in a more holistic fashion are very well received by the Commission. If I can just go back and ask a couple of tie-up questions for this mandated low-cost plan. You've talked about it being up to 2 gigabytes. How would you propose that the plan deal with instances where consumers would go up beyond the 2 gigabytes? Do you see that as a scale of payment for extra gigabytes, or do you see that as a situation where throttling would be acceptable? Had you thought about how that would be taken into consideration?
We did think about it, and we would propose that there be no overage charges, but that throttling or at slower speeds after that 2 gigabyte mark would be acceptable. We have noted in some requests for information responses significant issues with overage charges, especially the price and how high they are. So if we're trying through this basic use plan to make the plan affordable and accessible to consumers who are looking for that basic use plan, having the potential for overage charges, we think it goes counter to that narrative.
And can I just add, though, based on what Mr. Klaas said earlier about the very low ramping down to the point where it becomes not usable, we'd be happy with throttling, but not throttling simply, particularly because this is a lower cost plan, not throttling to a point where the phone becomes useless from a data perspective.
Right. We saw in the CRTC survey that consumers were reluctant to consider flanker brands as a viable option. Why do you think that would be?
If I can just add one point to the previous question before responding.
Absolutely.
I would refer my eyes popped out of my head when I was looking at this CRTC's exhibit number 2, placed on the record of the existing lower priced plans. And I understand the difference between discrimination and undue discrimination. That there can be benefits to differentiating products in the market in order to make them more affordable. Pay less, get less, but still have access, right? But I see here we have overage fees in the range of 10 cents per megabyte, $2 for 20 megabyte, 25 cents per megabyte, $2 per megabyte for some of these plans that are ostensibly on the lower end of the market. $2 per megabyte, quite frankly, is a usurious rate, and I cannot believe that this is in the market. For $15 a base plan, they're charging orders of magnitude more than what the cost that the CRTC has determined for this is. So to me, it looks like a vehicle to get someone in the door for a low introductory price, after which they'll inevitably incur these fees. So I think it is very important that these types of plans, to the extent that they would be allowed to use overage charges, those charges would have to be controlled. I know that the CRTC is forborne from regulating the price, but I disagree strongly with the idea that means the price is just by definition, and I think in the CRTC's exhibit here we have an example.
So you're referring to the TELUS plans that offer no data, but if the customer uses data, they're paying $2 per megabyte? Is that the ones you're looking at?
The second to last and the third to last in the list here. TELUS, $15
right, TELUS.
prepaid. And I mean, TELUS, I believe, is offering better plans themselves, potentially through their flanker brand or not. So, I mean, I think that this can speak to your present question.
And most of these plans, these $15 and under, have no data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know in some circumstances whether the use of data from these other plans might incur fee at a rate. I think part of the problem is that it's not necessarily transparent. But those are TELUS branded, right? And so with respect to your current question, I do recall seeing research that the CRTC had conducted with respect to trust in brands. And so I think there are a certain demographic who will go for the TELUS and the Bell because of a certain level of trust. The marketing is targeted towards certain demographics. TELUS's flanker brand, for instance, Kudo, runs ads on television, YouTube, and so on, that actually claim we're not like the big guys. Don't go with the big guys, go with us, right? So while a flanker might be offering a plan that's objectively better than this one, and in my opinion, no rational person who thought they might ever use data could actually take this plan, it's nevertheless still in the market.
So in your view, it's more that the plans that are offered are are not sufficient to meet the consumer's demands, as opposed to consumer awareness about the fact that these flanker brands travel on the same network as the national MNOs?
More transparency would definitely help in respect to the relationship between the flanker brands and the main brands. I know there's some concern with respect to dilution of the perception of quality in the main brand, although I think that the quality, at least in my experience, is either overtly disclosed with respect to the reduction in quality of speed in the bargain brands, or the reduction of quality in customer service that's associated with the mid-range flanker brands. However, I think there are problems with respect to the relationship between these things. The companies will come and point to their lower price plans to say that there's competition in the market, but a customer calling the main brand may not be referred to. So TELUS might have a superior plan to this, and quite frankly, I think this is a trap, this plan, to generate the cream, the extra additional $2 from time to time. Will a customer who calls TELUS and indicates an interest in this plan be informed by the sales representative that TELUS's other flanker brands offer something that is objectively superior? I listened to their testimony last week, and it didn't seem that they gave a straight answer to that question.
Do you know whether in your province consumer groups have initiatives in place to help consumers find information about the different options available to them for the myriad of plans that are out there? Do you offer anything like that?
We don't have, CAC Manitoba does not specifically have a program or a website you can go to that says, here's how you can compare the phone plans, although you have now given me a very good idea. That's something we should do. But we certainly do we certainly have a lot of opportunities to talk with consumers about it. When we are out doing public speaking, it is a frequent question. If it's not on my agenda, I am sure to be asked, about how do we make these comparisons? What kinds of things should we be looking for? So there is certainly a need for that, and you have just given me a very good idea. So Thank you. And I'm not aware of other consumer groups who offer that. I don't know, Damon, if you are.
No, not at this point, no.
Do you think there's a role here for the Commission to require the wireless service providers to, for example, ensure that their customer service reps are properly trained so that they do point consumers to those alternatives, providing links on their websites to lower cost plans, or making more clear visual displays in their stores?
I think that would be an excellent idea. I think I can echo what Mr. Klaas said, just from my experience with consumers, that there is not overwhelming knowledge about which flanker brands belong to which of the three big companies, or even that they do belong to the three big companies. A lot of consumers really don't realize that. So, the more that they can be informed by the person over the phone that they're speaking with, or informed on a website, or informed through whatever visual displays are used in the actual bricks and mortar locations, would be great.
And do you have anything else to add in terms of the gaps that you see in the market regarding the needs of consumers for low-cost or occasional use plans that you haven't addressed right now?
Yeah, so one thing that does come into play, I see this directly in the organization that I lead. So within the Indigenous population, there is a range of individuals who do not currently possess the capacity to address these things themselves. So they need support. They need direct support from organizations like ours and others. And to be able to discern what is fair and reasonable when they're negotiating their phone plan. And some, like I say, some would be illiterate. How does a person who is illiterate do that, So we've got, some challenges that way. And so anything that would make it easier for these individuals to be able to make these decisions from a more rational or fair and reasonable way would be helpful. And for us as organizations to have access to those things as well, make it easier for us to support those individuals. And if a basic plan was available, then more of these individuals would be able to access phones. As an example, we have a training program right now that we run at our center back in Winnipeg, and these trainees can't afford phones because they're paid at a minimum wage, a rate of minimum wage. And so we purchase phones for them, and we were able to get grants to do that. So, and it's proving to be very helpful to them, and so we have good evidence that works better.
I just have a couple more questions regarding a model of an MVNO. If the Commission were to mandate an MVNO access, you've indicated in your submissions that it should apply to the three, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS. Do you think other carriers should be obligated to provide MVNO access, such as SaskTel or regional carriers in other provinces that have facilities?
In terms of the range of offers that are available on this front, I think that the PIAC proposal has a thoughtful solution to this question. Who should it apply to? They've suggested a timed phase-in, so I would say, as an expert, not necessarily representing the group, that I think in terms of whether it should apply to regional providers or not, I think PIAC's proposal is quite thoughtful.
And do you think it would be important to establish investment targets for MVNOs that might be mandated of the facilities type to ensure that investment continues?
I think that the Competition Bureau's model is it correct that this is essentially what you're referring to?
And my last question, I'm just circling back a little bit to the issue of win-backs. Do you have a position on how you see win-backs, whether you support them or you think that there needs to be constraints on win-backs?
So if I have an opportunity, and I think Mr. Johnson would like to speak to it, and Ms. DeLay, I'm just going to say, with regards to the topic of win-backs, consumers some consumers can use that fairly effectively, but they find it very frustrating. You feel that as a consumer who's been loyal to a company, you should be able to access the deals that are going to make it possible for you to start to save some money. You don't feel that you should have to leave a company and then go to another company that's offering you a better deal, which they won't offer to their current customers, and then be won back by the original company that you were with. And so they are frustrating and a very roundabout way to go about offering people lower price plans from our perspective.
Again, I can evidence how an MVNO opportunity could be quite beneficial to the Indigenous community. So, and we've already done some work in this area. So we've established a small entity known as Farfox in our center. So it gave us the ability to own our own phone system. And then we were, granted access. So we negotiate directly with the telcos on the cost of phones to Farfox, and also, data, etc. And so we made, in the first instance, we made a deal with Rogers. And then the next year we're now currently with TELUS. So it's using the current tools available to us, or access points, that CRTC has created. But I think and I know the MBO would be another big step forward for us. It's really, as an example, we did a study 2 years ago now to look at indigenizing the co-op model in Canada. And so we completed that work. And so basically what I'm speaking to here is Indigenous peoples looking at current business models for anything and how we would indigenize those, how they would be different, Indigenous owned. And that doesn't mean that everyone's going to do it that way, but we, and I mean we is where we are right now in our center, Neeganon Center in Winnipeg, it was a social enterprise before that word was even used. And then it's like a cooperative structure because as a tenant organization, the council that I lead is a part owner of the building. And then we achieve economies of scale in that particular model. And any excess revenue we generate is reinvested in the building, in the services to our community. And at times, when we established another social enterprise called Mother Earth Recycling, we had the necessary $300,000 investment to establish Mother Earth. And now that's led to a partnership with IKEA. So none of these things I see as any kind of direct danger or even serious competition to these, magnificently large companies. If the willingness, if the door is open to, as I say, reasonably negotiate something, a win-win situation. But like I say, the MBO would be a new door of opportunity for Indigenous peoples who want to move in that direction. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are all my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Leisner, if I could just add a few points to your last two questions, if I may.
Sure.
So just regarding your question about the regional carriers having access or providing access to MVNOs, the Manitoba Coalition certainly recognizes the need not to discourage further investments by regional carriers, including Shaw and potentially even Explore Mobile in Manitoba. But we want to make sure that from a consumer perspective, really the objective is to meet the consumer need. And so there's no guarantee necessarily that those regional carriers will in the future meet the consumer need. And then regarding the facilities, the condition to invest in facilities in order to access the wholesale market, to Mr. Johnston's point regarding non-traditional business models, we would just want to ensure that smaller, newer, innovative companies who may not meet a traditional business model would not be prevented from entering the marketplace, especially given that they may be able to meet the needs of consumers better in certain demographics. And then the last point, just to your win-back question, we did outline some recommendations in our RFI responses to the CRTC's letter of July 5th of last year. And really the Manitoba Coalition's position there is that offers should be made broadly in terms of product offerings to the public, and so that it may be appropriate to put some conditions on win-backs once a consumer has decided to leave. As Ms. DeZorcy pointed out, if a consumer is calling, complaining about the price or the service, we wouldn't want the consumers to be precluded from being offered a better price in order to stay with that company. But if a consumer has decided to leave, that cooling off period of 90 days may be appropriate, just in order to equalize the marketplace and make sure that product offerings are being made to all consumers and not just those who have decided to take that step and leave the company.
Great, thank you. And I take the position as being you're more in favor of the PIAC model of a mandated MVNO than the Competition Bureau model of a mandated MVNO.
Yeah, I think it's actually, in my mind, quite hard to actually see how the Competition Bureau's model is an MVNO. It's an extension of support for the facilities-based regional providers, which I think is something that the CRTC and government should continue to do, that is, to be clear, supporting the regional carriers. I think the benefits that we've seen, the improvements we've seen, are primarily due to that and have only come about thanks to the mechanisms such as the set-asides and the auctions and the roaming regulations that exist. But I think that the Competition Bureau's overly restrictive in terms of setting essentially a cap on how much competition that model can produce. We'll have a fourth carrier. Maybe these fourth carriers will extend their networks everywhere, but that's it. That's as best as we can do. And the idea of fining them if they don't meet those build-out requirements seems overly harsh to me. I think if I had to pick one or two of the models, CNOC's full MVNO model or PX phase-in approach are most closely aligned with what I would view as an MVNO model that strikes an appropriate balance.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Levy.
Good afternoon, or good morning, I guess. I talked on last week to a presentation made by the province of British Columbia, and they had done a huge survey. They had about 15,000 people respond to the online side, and their statistics. And the outcome was not terribly different, I don't think, from the generalizations that came out of your surveys. But in comments afterwards, it was explained that in some cases people are having to cut back on their food budget in order to afford what is now considered a necessity, some ways of communicating with the outside world. And I wondered whether if, as part of the Manitoba Social Assistance Program, whether there is a budgeted item for a phone or some sort of device as part of the package that they put together when they're trying to determine what social assistance should include. Do you know whether that's the case?
I'm going to say that I believe that the current employment assistance program in Manitoba offers the opportunity for a landline phone. I don't believe there is, and I stand to be corrected because I haven't checked that recently, so I'm going to say in past there hasn't been, that's more accurate, an opportunity for internet or cell phone to be a part of a plan. I don't know, is that, yeah, okay, so Mr. Johnson concurs with me on that. And, when you say people are giving up food, to be able to pay their cell phone, yeah, or prescriptions, or taking their drugs every other day. We hear that sometimes instead of every day, as they should be, their prescription drugs. Or, all kinds of ways of trying to balance, using payday loans or, all kinds of ways that they try to balance out so that they can get this communication device so that they can be called back on a job interview so that they can get a job to change their situation. It's sort of a this step to this step to this step to this step, but at the heart of it lies the ability to communicate, to go on the internet, to make applications, to, have proper health care that you get through, having a number that you can give to your doctor for getting results on, just one thing after another that kind of puts barriers in the way of moving forward. So thank you for that question.
And Just to add too, I mean, it's becoming increasingly, a human safety issue. Having access, direct access to a phone. We have many examples now in the media where individuals' lives have been saved because they had a cell phone. So I think that's an important issue as well.
Commissioner Barron.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for your submissions and presentation. I have a question that relates to the research that you did that tested your basic use wireless plan. I noted that you said the interest generated was at the 50% level. I'm wondering if in your data you were able to determine that that interest was coming from a particular demographic, or would you say that in fact it was widespread interest in that plan?
So I'll start while Ms. DeZorcy actually looks at our surveys. And the reason we're going to take a look is that one survey, the one with 1,000 Manitobans, was more representative of the population, whereas the one that was circulated amongst consumer groups had a very large proportion of respondents associated with food banks, and so who would have been lower income, and who were in fact lower income according to the income information they provided. And so I believe the interest was in both surveys, and so would have been also from the more larger demographic, but the interest was certainly there from the lower income survey as well.
If I can add, I really just want to have a sense whether the interest was specific to a particular niche, whether it was low income or an age demographic, or whether it was widespread interest across the board on having a low-cost
Thank you. We certainly wouldn't expect that consumers who currently have a plan with much higher data allowances at a much higher price point, we would not expect, based on the responses and talking to consumers, that those consumers would let go of their existing plan for the smaller data bucket that would be in the basic use plan. So the basic use plan is really, the objective is to kind of meet that minimum or basic requirement to sort of meaningfully participate in society at an affordable price point. And so we've tried to achieve that balance with the 2 gigabytes. Someone who is currently using 5 or 10 or has unlimited are simply likely not going to change to that 2 gigabyte plan. But someone who currently maybe is in the proportion in Mr. Klaas's research who are not adopting cell phones in the lowest quintile, they may be able to afford a plan such as this one.
And the difference between the large online survey at 51% who were interested, the smaller survey with more consumers that may be more limited in income was 60% interest.
Thank you.
And also a factor, if a package like that was available, then governments or whoever, support income assistance programs might be more willing to make those available to the people they're serving. So, that's another opportunity. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, for your fulsome responses. We will recess now for 15 minutes, resume 11:15. Thank you. Oh, pardon me, a question from legal counsel. You're not quite off the hook yet. I'm going to ask them.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you, counsel.
Sorry, it's early on a Monday morning. Well, not so early anymore, but still Monday morning. I just have one question to ask of you, and it's a record-building question. I'd like to refer you to Figure 40 found in the report prepared by Mr. Klaas and Mr. Winsek, which you filed as part of your 15 May 2019 intervention. This figure is titled Average Capital Intensity for Mobile Markets in Canada and the EU, excluding Spectrum, 2013-2016. Now, I understand that one of the sources of data that was used for the purposes of that figure was the Commission's own communications monitoring report. But could I get you to undertake to provide for the record, the other data that you use to calculate these averages and to create that graph?
Yeah, I will undertake to provide that information.
Thank you very much. And just a quick follow-up on that. If you have any more recent data, for example, for the years 2017 or more recent, could you provide those as well, please?
I don't believe that I do, but I will look into it for you, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Then with that, I will once again thank you for your contribution to the proceeding. It's very helpful. We'll recess for 15, return at 11:15. Thank you.